This hill may look like your typical scenic viewpoint, but it's actually one of the most important battlegrounds of the Vietnam War. During the war, this hill, known as Hamburger Hill, more US troops came to rescue them, but not before suffering heavy casualties themselves. In total, more than 2,000 US soldiers and an estimated 7,000 North Vietnamese soldiers died in the battle for Hamburger Hill, making it one of the deadliest battles of the war. Was the site of one of the bloodiest battles between American and North Vietnamese forces. The Americans needed to capture this hill to prevent the North Vietnamese army from using it to launch attacks on their base. So they sent in a small team of soldiers to take it. What happens next is straight-up carnage. The team fought their way up the hill, repelling wave after wave of North Vietnamese soldiers. But by the time they reached the top, they were exhausted and out of ammunition. Luckily, do you think the cost was worth it? Let me know in the comments. On May 1969, men of the 1st Battalion, 26 Marines fought one of the longest and bloodiest battles in the Vietnam War. The Battle for Hill 937 near Da Nang lasted 48 hours straight. But few of those were as brutal and costly as the Battle for Hill 937. On May 1969, the men of the 1st Battalion, 26 Marines, also known as the Devil Dogs, were holding down Hill 937 near the demilitarized zone south of Da Nang. They had been there since April 1968. As far as they knew, the hill was theirs. But as the early morning mist cleared, they realized they were completely surrounded. What was so important about this hill? To answer that question, let's go back to the beginning. They hoped that with one big victory, they could force the communists to the negotiating table. Once there, they would form a secure perimeter around Da Nang, which was increasingly coming under attack from North Vietnamese forces. The Marines got to work immediately. On April 1968, they began a massive assault on the hill. The North Vietnamese had been defeated and the Marines had captured Hill 937. The US military brass was ecstatic. In the weeks following the battle, the Marines were constantly harassed by enemy soldiers. They would launch surprise attacks, lay mines and set up ambushes. And to make matters worse, the weather was hot and humid. The Marines were drenched in sweat, their bodies aching, but they held on. They fought with everything they had, but they were slowly losing hope. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted, but those who fought there will never forget the grueling 48 hours they spent on the hill. The Battle for Hill 937 was one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War. The men of the 1st Battalion, 26 Marines fought bravely, repelling wave after wave of attackers despite being outnumbered and exhausted. The battle lasted 48 hours, and during that time, the Marines suffered heavy casualties. But they never gave up. Finally, when the fighting ended, the Marines had won a major victory. The Marines were on edge, always expecting the next attack to be the big one. Then in May 1969, it happened. Let me know your thoughts on the Battle for Hill 937 in the comments below. Thank you all for watching and I'll see you next time. They believed that capturing Hill 937 would turn the tide of the war. Mortar and machine guns, the Marines were caught off guard. They barely managed to repel the attack, but it was only the beginning. Over the next 48 hours, the Marines would face wave after wave of attackers. The North Vietnamese didn't care about casualties. They kept coming again and again until the Marines were exhausted and demoralized. But as it turned out, the Battle for Hill 937 was just beginning. They attacked from 3 sides, hoping to catch the North Vietnamese by surprise. But the communists were prepared. The Marines quickly encountered heavy resistance. On May 1969, after 48 hours of fighting, the Battle for Hill 937 came to an end. The North Vietnamese had been defeated, but the battle had come at a cost. Of the 185 Marines on the hill, only 57 were still uninjured, the rest were dead or wounded. That's when the Joint Chiefs of Staff turned their attention to a small hill south of Da Nang. The hill was unassuming, just a small rise in a sea of green. But to the US military, it was the perfect opportunity to score a much-needed victory. In the early 1960s, the United States began sending military advisors to South Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese government fight against the communist North Vietnamese. The Battle for Hill 937 was one of the longest and bloodiest of the Vietnam War. The men of the 1st Battalion, 26 Marines, fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. They fought for 48 hours straight, repelling wave after wave of attackers. They were low on supplies and ammunition, but they never gave up. Finally, when they thought they could fight no more, relief arrived and the North Vietnamese were defeated. The Marines had won a major victory, but it had come at a great cost. Of the 185 Marines on the hill, only 57 were still uninjured, the rest were dead or wounded. The Battle for Hill 937 was a testament to the bravery and tenacity of the men who fought there. The Marines were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted, but they never gave up. They fought until the very end, and in the process, they won one of the most important victories of the Vietnam War. But as the war escalated, the US found itself bogged down in a conflict it couldn't win. Slowly but surely, they began to take control of the hill. By the end of the first day of fighting, the Marines had secured the top of the hill, but the fighting was far from over. The North Vietnamese launched counterattack after counterattack, but the Marines held firm day after day. The fighting continued. The Marines were eventually able to expand their perimeter and solidify their hold on the hill. But it wasn't easy. The North Vietnamese kept coming, wave after wave of attackers. The Marines were exhausted and taking heavy casualties, but they held on. Despite pouring men and resources into the war, the Americans were still losing ground to the North Vietnamese. And during that time, the Marines repelled over 100 separate attacks by North Vietnamese Army regulars. So what was so important about this hill, and why did it take so much effort to capture? During the Vietnam War, there were numerous clashes between the US Marines and the North Vietnamese Army. The Marines were almost overwhelmed, but they managed to hold on. When the dust finally settled, the Marines had won a major victory. They had repelled the North Vietnamese Army and defended Hill 937, but the battle had come at a cost. Of the 185 Marines on the hill, only 57 were still uninjured, the rest were dead or wounded. As soon as the first rays of sunlight hit the slopes of Hill 937, the enemy opened fire. Machine gun bullets and rocket-propelled grenades rained down on the Marine positions. They were determined to take the hill at any cost. As the battle raged, the Marines held their ground, repelling wave after wave of attackers. But it wasn't easy. The Marines were outnumbered and outgunned. For every one Marine on the hill, there were at least 10 North Vietnamese soldiers trying to take it. And to make matters worse, the Marines were low on ammunition and supplies, but despite the odds, they held on. From their concealed positions all around the hill, the North Vietnamese Army launched a massive assault. The Marines quickly realized this was no drill. In the early hours of May, thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers began a massive attack on Hill 937, but just as the sun began to set, the North Vietnamese launched their final assault. It was the largest and most intense attack of the battle. So why did the North Vietnamese Army attack Hill 937? In an effort to turn the tide of the war, the US military began searching for a way to inflict a decisive defeat on the North Vietnamese Army. The plan was simple. The Marines would seize the hill and hold it until the rest of the US military could deploy to the area. Despite the fierce fighting, the Marines managed to push the North Vietnamese back. Finally, on May 1968, the fighting ended. The North Vietnamese were not about to give up the hill without a fight. At 5 a.m., the North Vietnamese Army launched a massive assault on Hill 937. Thousands of soldiers attacked from all sides, firing rockets. Throughout the battle, the Marines were low on supplies and ammunition. They were forced to ration their food and water. Then, just when it seemed like the North Vietnamese would finally break them, relief arrived. Hill 937 was an important strategic victory for the US military, but it came at a great cost. Today, the story of the battle for Hill 937 is largely forgotten. What do you think? The war in Afghanistan lasted 20 years and cost billions of dollars. We all know that, but have you ever wondered what it cost in human lives? On one side, there was a well-equipped regular army, and on the other, an insurgency with mostly homemade bombs. On September 4th, a small team of U.S. soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment stationed in the area was sent out to gather intel on insurgent activity. This team consisted of a platoon from the 2nd Battalion and a team from the Special Forces Operational Detachment, Alpha 9 or 1. There were about 80 soldiers in total. Their commanding officer was a man named Captain Andrew Dennis. Yet 3,537 U.S. soldiers lost their lives in that conflict. And then there were also the Afghan soldiers and civilians who died in even greater numbers. At some point during the fight, Captain Dennis was wounded in the leg. Despite being injured, he continued to direct his men until he was hit by another RPG and killed. Today, we are going to try and understand the human cost of this war by looking at just one battle. All in all, 76 soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment were wounded or killed in the battle, as well as 8 soldiers from the Special Forces Operational Detachment. Alpha 9 or 1, the Americans had come to rescue the soldiers involved in the battle, but they had also come to rescue the Afghan civilians. This would have been a relief to some of the soldiers, but others were angry and bitter. 3 of the soldiers were later found dead after the battle. According to a study, 38% of the soldiers in the battalion were high school dropouts and 27% had not graduated from high school. For some, it was a way to make something of themselves. For others, it was a way to help take care of their families. They too were poor and desperate and saw the war as a chance to improve their situation. But most of the Afghans who fought in this war were not volunteers. Almost half of the soldiers were under the age of 21 when they enlisted. Many of them were teenagers who had never held a weapon before the war. And many of them had been promised money or other incentives to join the fight, and the American soldiers knew that they had to do more than just fight. Others were simply too afraid to trust them, but the soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment tried their best. They had to show the local population that they were there to help them, only to find out that they were unpaid and that they were expected to live hand to mouth like everyone else in the country. Depression and other mental health problems. Some of them turned to drugs or alcohol to cope with their problems. Others became violent or withdrawn. One that resulted in the loss of American lives, but also Afghan lives, this time as trainers and advisors, helped build schools and provided food and supplies to families in need. But despite their efforts, the soldiers knew that, but they felt frustrated nonetheless. But it's important to remember that behind every statistic there is a story of a human being who lived, loved, and died. Everyone lost in that battle was a victim of the war. They got used to the constant danger and the never-ending fight against an elusive enemy. Was it worth losing thousands of lives and spending billions of dollars to achieve nothing? There was still a lot of resentment among the local population. They had come to Afghanistan to defeat the Taliban and to bring democracy to the country. If you want to learn more about the war in Afghanistan, stay tuned for more videos. Some of them went on to lead successful lives. They got married, had children, and started businesses. But we can tell you the stories of the men who fought and died in that war. It might not give us all the answers, but it will give us some insight into what this war cost those who fought it. They had been told that their mission was to capture or kill the enemy, and that's what they tried to do. What they did not realize was that the enemy they were fighting wasn't just an abstraction. He was a human being like them. They would always be haunted by the memories of war. The faces of their fallen comrades would continue to haunt their nightmares. And the memories of the people they had killed would continue to weigh on their conscience. But afterwards, when the soldiers arrived at the hospital in Khost, They encountered something that shocked them, invasion, and it revealed the true cost of the war. Dozens of dead Afghan civilians lay on stretchers alongside the wounded soldiers. The year is 2009 and the location is Wainat, a village in the eastern part of Afghanistan. One of them was a man named Mohammed Wali Khan, who was awarded the Bronze Star Medal posthumously for his actions during the Battle of Wainat. The mission was described as an intelligence-gathering patrol to interview elders and local leaders about recent attacks in the region. When the battle started, he manned a machine gun and defended the position until he ran out of ammunition. Then he grabbed an RPG and fired at the enemy until he was killed. Even though these people had sought refuge in the hospital, these soldiers argued that they should be considered enemy combatants, that they had received military training, and that they had willingly chosen to wage war against the coalition forces. For them, the Battle of Wainat wasn't just a battle between two armies. It was a battle between two opposing cultures. However, the unit had been told to be prepared for contact with insurgents because of heightened tensions in the area. The Americans took up defensive positions, suppressing the enemy with heavy gunfire while they waited for reinforcements to arrive. But once again, they came under heavy fire. The insurgents were using a mix of rocket-propelled grenades, machine guns, and small arms. The soldiers returned fire while trying to move to a more advantageous position, but they were being picked off one by one. But soon it became clear that the men in the hills were too numerous. And so the decision was made to abandon the Humvees and trucks and to evacuate down the mountain on foot. And sure enough, after they had interviewed the village elders, the Americans came under fire. The enemy was hidden in the hills above the village. The order was given, the soldiers fell back and started their descent, maintaining a defensive perimeter. And soon it became clear that this was no longer a mission. This was now a battle for survival. With their leadership gone, the remaining soldiers continued to fight until they were eventually rescued by a team of 80 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division. They had been beheaded by the enemy. In total, 86 American soldiers lost their lives in the Battle of Wainat, but the death toll didn't end there. According to the New York Times, an estimated 30 to 40 militants were killed in the battle. The villagers had fled to the hospital for safety, seeking protection from the intense fighting. In their minds, the Afghan soldiers and the civilians weren't victims of the insurgents, they were the insurgents. These soldiers could understand why they had been ordered to risk their lives to save people who hated them so much. The American soldiers were mainly from poor rural communities. Many of them had dropped out of school before graduating high school. Many of these young men joined the army to escape poverty or to follow in the footsteps of family members who had served in the military. These soldiers had no interest in democracy or human rights. Some of the Afghan soldiers and policemen who fought alongside the Americans suffered from the same problems. They were conscripts, men who were forced to fight in an army that they didn't want to be a part of. Despite the odds, the Afghan soldiers showed incredible bravery, often fighting alongside their American counterparts with little to no training. Khan was a member of the Afghan border police who fought alongside the Americans. But the war wasn't just about fighting battles. It was also about winning hearts and minds. This was easier said than done. Some of the villagers in the area supported the Taliban and saw the Americans as invaders. They organized medical clinics. This was understandable given the situation they had been living in for decades. The war in Afghanistan was one of the longest wars in American history. For many of the soldiers involved, it became a way of life. And when they finally came home, they found it difficult to readjust to civilian life. Many of them suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. It was almost like they had been broken by the war, but the war didn't break them all. Others continued to serve in the military, rising to high ranks and earning prestigious medals. Some of them even returned to the battlefield, but no matter where they went or what they did, the Battle of Wainat was a turning point in the war in Afghanistan. It was one of the deadliest battles, since the U.S. easy to get caught up in the big picture and to lose sight of the human cost of war. The Battle of Hamburger was a tragedy for everyone involved. It didn't matter whether you were American or Afghan, soldier or civilian, but perhaps the most tragic thing about the Battle of Hamburger is that the Americans won the battle but lost the war. But in the end, they were forced to withdraw in defeat and the Taliban returned to power. The question is, was it worth it? We can't answer that question. It's a moral question that each individual will have to answer for themselves. We can honor their sacrifice by telling their stories and by making sure that their deaths were not in vain. For over 240 years, the Battle of Hamburger has been called the worst defeat in the history of the United States. But is it really that bad? Well, that depends on whether you ask a historian or a politician. By June, they had taken New York City and forced the Americans to abandon their defenses along the Hudson River, opening up the entire northern colonies to invasion. George Washington desperately needed a victory, but his army was in North Carolina, trying to finish off a rebellion against the British led by the infamous G.A.T. Raleigh. British supply lines were already stretched thin, and the mountainous terrain made things even harder. But the biggest problem was that the British didn't know the terrain. When the British began their advance, he sent out scouts to find them and was able to ambush them. Even worse, their supplies were constantly being destroyed by American guerrillas. Instead, he decided to scout around to see if he could find a way to outflank them. Then they spent the night watching each other, shooting deer, and getting ready for the next day. Meanwhile, Arnold and Stark led a counterattack on the British right, driving them all the way across the field. But then both generals called off the pursuit and turned their attention to the British artillery, which had been bombarding them all morning. Out of 2,100 men, only 379 were able to make it back. As for the Americans, they lost 60 men killed and 243 wounded. Their total losses were about 4% compared to 18% for the British. Burgoyne surrendered the next day. You could argue that 800 men is a fair price to pay to win a war, but how about 1,500 men? That's how many men the Americans lost at the Battle of Long Island, an early battle in the war where they were clearly outmatched and had no hope of winning. Compare that to Hamburger and you can see why politicians love it. It looks great on paper, especially if you do and bother to count the people who died of disease or starvation in prison camps. The goal is not to kill the most enemy soldiers, but to win the war. Back then, military victories were considered the only way to win a war. The idea that you could negotiate with your enemy and convince him to lay down his arms was unheard of. Clausewitz's book on military theory wouldn't be published for another 50 years. And wars are won not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the people. By the time Hamburger happened, the British public was fully invested in the war and any talk of negotiation would have been seen as surrender. And if we want to win them, we need to learn how to fight them. I'll leave it here, but if you want to hear more about forgotten battles like this one, stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Just imagine if someone had told King George III that he could end the war by giving the colonists more representation in Parliament. He would have laughed them out of the room. If they could capture the cannons, the battle would be over. Sure, it boosted morale and convinced a few European nations to join the war effort, but only because it gave the impression that the Americans could win. In reality, they were still struggling to keep their heads above water. And it was far from clear that the war would ever end in their favor. It was only the second day of September when the firing began, and when it comes to wars of independence, victories aren't really worth that much if you can't follow them up with more victories. The Americans proved that with patience and clever diplomacy, they could get France, Spain, and the Dutch to support them. The British, on the other hand, spent billions of pounds trying to beat them in the field. In fact, it was arguably the beginning of the end for the British because it marked the point where they stopped trying to win the hearts and minds of the colonists. They doubled down on military solutions, leading to battles like Yorktown. Burgoyne realized that he had lost the battle, but he refused to surrender. He retreated through the woods, hoping to rally his troops and escape during the night. The Americans gained valuable time to prepare for future battles. Morale was high and enlistment rates skyrocketed. Why? Well, when you look at the casualty numbers, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. The British lost 18% of their army, but less than half of that was due to enemy fire. Most of their losses were stragglers who got picked off or starved to death. Is that what we want our army to do? Pick off stragglers for days after a battle? That's not a real victory. On the other hand, the British suffered heavy losses, both in terms of material and manpower. It was the turning point of the war. But the Americans followed them closely, picking off stragglers and burning their supplies. Neither side knew exactly where the other was, so they spent most of the morning firing at invisible enemies. Then Burgoyne realized that he couldn't attack head-on, and so he tried to flank the Americans and drive them out of their camp. His troops came within 300 yards of the American left wing before the Americans spotted them. What he didn't know was that the entire time he was marching around, Stark and Arnold were doing the same thing. They found each other at the same spot, and then they raced to get their men there as quickly as possible. Finally, just before Burgoyne reached the fort, General Benedict Arnold arrived with 2,000 men. Other units trickled in afterward, but the majority of the American force was still absent. Arnold and Stark argued about who was in charge. Stark wanted to attack right away, but Arnold insisted on waiting for more troops. He also wanted to avoid a battle where they'd be fighting on 3 sides at once. So he ordered them to dig in on a ridge overlooking the valley below. Unfortunately for the British, the Continental Army was not yet ready to mount an offensive and most of their troops were committed elsewhere. So Washington sent Stark orders to hold the fort and wait for reinforcements. This frustrated Stark because he could have won a major victory if only he'd had more men, and that was the biggest problem. They had never marched across the Green Mountains and neither had anyone else. There were no roads. But one man who did know the area very well was a man named John Stark, and while he wasn't a general, he knew something that none of the British commanders did, that there was an old Indian trail that wound through the mountains. It was much more difficult than a road, but it was doable. Whom I covered in my video about the Battle of Kings Mountain, because they have very different opinions about what makes a battle good or bad. But this is one of those rare cases where politicians and historians generally agree. It was a terrible battle, but not for the reason you might think. And if we want to learn from it today, we need to stop focusing on casualties and start looking at strategy. In August of 1777, the British were winning the war. British General John Burgoyne wanted to take Fort Ticonderoga and the vital Lake Champlain trade route into Canada. To do that, he needed to march south through the Green Mountains, a difficult area to traverse even in peacetime. He decided to begin with an amphibious assault at the northern end of the lake. In the meantime, 2 other British generals would take the western route into the fort and another would take the eastern one. In theory, they would all meet up together after defeating the colonial militia. It was actually an extremely clever plan, almost too clever, which goes to show how desperate the British were for a win. In reality, there were so many problems. The first was simply logistics. Stark was a farmer and local militia commander who helped guide American forces during the Saratoga campaign in 1777. Despite having a numerical advantage, the British were forced to play defense for weeks. When Burgoyne heard that the Americans were dug in, he assumed they had more troops coming and thought that attacking head-on would be a bad idea. Both armies arrived just after sunset and set up camp. Major General William Scott led a bayonet charge that broke the British line, forcing them to retreat back into the forest. While the British were reloading their guns, the Americans charged across the open field and captured the entire artillery train without losing a single man. By the time they reached the safety of their main camp, they had lost nearly everything, including their cannons, their supplies, and a week's worth of rations. To say that the Battle of Caransebes was a disaster for the British would be an understatement. And yet that's not why politicians and historians hate it. What's more, 800 of those missing were actually captured and spent the remainder of the war in prison camps. But historians hate it because they know that victory doesn't always come from the battlefield. Moreover, Karan Sebes showed that even a crushing victory could come at an enormous cost. But in the end, it was the political victories, not the military ones, that won the war. So what are the lessons here? First of all, we should stop judging battles based on casualty numbers alone, especially if we're talking about wars of independence. It's easy to criticize the generals of the past for not realizing this, but in their defense, they were operating under completely different rules. And let's be honest, it probably wouldn't have made a difference even if they'd read it. At the end of the day, wars are about politics, not casualties. We pay tribute to their bravery and sacrifice and honor the memory of those who gave their last full measure of devotion on this hallowed ground. He was part of the 47th Medical Detachment, Charlie 2, 1st Cavalry Division. He was a medic and he was there at the top of that hill. He said it was one of the scariest things he'd ever seen. He pulled a lot of people out of the fighting that day, trying to get them down off the hill. They were under heavy attack by the North Vietnamese army. However, the victory came at a great cost. In just a few hours, the battalion had suffered over 200 casualties, including 38 killed and 131 wounded. This made Hamburger Hill one of the bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War, 73 years ago today, on May 10, 1969. The United States suffered one of its bloodiest days in the Vietnam War with over 200 casualties at the Battle of Hamburger Hill. They saw the battle as a testament to the courage and determination of the American soldiers who fought valiantly despite the heavy casualties. The conflicting perspectives surrounding Hamburger Hill reflected the deeply divided public opinion at home. The battle highlighted the challenges and complexities of the conflict and the need for a comprehensive approach that considered not only military objectives but also the political and social aspects of the war. And films, ensuring that the stories of the soldiers who fought there are preserved and their sacrifices are honored. One notable account is the book and subsequent film Hamburger Hill by Ken Burns, which provides an in-depth look at the battle and its aftermath, featuring interviews with the soldiers who were there. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the American public grew increasingly weary of the conflict. Infantry regiment known as the No-Fear Warriors of the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile were inserted by helicopter into landing zone X-ray near the Cambodian border. Their mission was to seize Hill 937, a key vantage point that the Viet Cong had used to harass and ambush US and South Vietnamese forces. The soldiers, exhausted and wounded, fought bravely, their determination unwavering. More troops were inserted into the area, providing much-needed support to the beleaguered defenders. The soldiers, battered and bruised, regrouped and prepared for a new wave of attacks. They fought with valor, their determination to survive and succeed unwavering. As the battle reached its climax, the soldiers found themselves in a desperate struggle. The VC attacked in massive numbers, determined to capture the hill. As the dust settled and the sounds of battle faded away, the soldiers surveyed the damage. The soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment emerged from the battle as heroes. They had faced overwhelming odds and emerged victorious. Known as the No-Fear Warriors of the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile, fought valiantly and emerged victorious from the intense battle at Hill 937, securing a hard-won victory that would be remembered as the Battle of Hamburger Hill. Their courage and determination had secured a vital strategic point and prevented the VC from launching further attacks. Despite their exhaustion and grief, see you there, they had accomplished their mission. The hill was a scene of devastation, with bodies strewn across the ground and equipment destroyed. It was a somber reminder of the heavy price they had paid for victory. The Americans, wounded and exhausted, fought back with everything they had. The fate of the hill hung in the balance. As the fighting continued, the soldiers demonstrated remarkable courage and resilience. Despite being outnumbered and facing overwhelming odds, they refused to back down. They knew that the VC would not give up easily, and they were right. With additional firepower, the soldiers were able to hold their ground and eventually repel the attacks. But as the night wore on, the situation became increasingly precarious. The VC continued to press their attack, determined to dislodge the Americans from the hill. The nation's highest military decoration, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The heavy casualties at Hamburger Hill led many to question the high cost of the war and its ultimate objective. They moved through the thick jungle under cover of darkness, their senses heightened, their rifles at the ready. The battle was on. As the fight intensified, the soldiers found themselves in a desperate struggle for survival. The VC were relentless, attacking in waves, forcing the Americans to fight tooth and nail for every inch of ground. The VC faltered, their attacks becoming less frequent and less intense. Finally, they retreated, leaving the Americans victorious but battered. The soldiers had successfully defended the hill, inflicting heavy casualties on the VC. The soldiers dug in, forming a defensive perimeter around the hill. They exchanged gunfire with the enemy, each shot echoing through the dense jungle. The air was thick with tension as they closed in on the enemy position. Suddenly, the tranquility of the jungle was shattered by a loud crack. A shot rang out, breaking the silence and signaling the start of the battle. From the moment they hit the ground, the soldiers of the 1/5 were under fire. The VC were dug in and well equipped with automatic weapons and grenades. As the Americans advanced, they were met with a withering hail of bullets and explosions. Some critics argued that the battle was a costly and unnecessary engagement that did not contribute to the overall strategic goals in Vietnam. They pointed to the high number of American casualties and the limited territorial gains as evidence of the battle's questionable value. This story is personal for me because my father was there. In this episode, we're gonna look at what happened at Hamburger Hill, why it was such a significant battle, and the impact it had on the men who fought there. The aftermath of Hamburger Hill saw calls for a reevaluation of the war's strategy and a desire for greater transparency and accountability from the government. The intense scrutiny placed on the battle led to investigations and inquiries into the decision-making process that led to the engagement and the conduct of the battle itself. These efforts aim to learn from the experience at Hamburger Hill and apply the lessons to future operations, emphasizing the importance of minimizing casualties while achieving strategic objectives. Despite heavy casualties, the Americans held their ground, demonstrating remarkable courage and resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The ferocity of the fighting was such that Hamburger Hill became a scene of hand-to-hand combat, with soldiers fighting in close quarters amidst a chaotic backdrop of gunfire and explosions. 1969, during the Vietnam War, Hamburger Hill was a turning point in the conflict, showcasing both the tenacity of the U.S. forces and the fierce determination of their adversaries. But the human cost was tremendous, with hundreds of casualties on both sides. This is not an episode you want to miss. Let's roll the intro. The Americans' objective: seize the hill, codenamed Hill 937 and subsequently known as Hamburger Hill. The NVA's motivation: prevent the U.S. from gaining a vantage point from which they could direct artillery fire onto NVA troop concentrations in the valleys below. In the annals of military history, few battles stand out as Hamburger Hill. A brutal clash that pitted the United States against the North Vietnamese Army on May 10th. The battle began on May when elements of the 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment known as the No Fear Warriors of the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile encountered a large North Vietnamese army force defending a key hill near the Cambodian border. As the battle raged throughout the day, the 1/5 endured relentless attacks from the NVA, who utilized a tactic known as the human wave. By the end of the day, the 1/5 had successfully seized and defended the hill, inflicting heavy casualties on the NVA. Among the casualties was 1st Lieutenant Harold G. Moore, whose actions during the battle would later be recognized posthumously with the Medal of Honor. The significance of Hamburger Hill extended beyond the battlefield. It captured the world's attention and sparked intense debate about the war's purpose and conduct. Others, however, argued that Hamburger Hill demonstrated the strength and tenacity of the U.S. military and its ability to overcome seemingly impossible odds. Hamburger Hill became a symbol of the war's controversial nature and the emotional toll it took on both the soldiers and the nation as a whole. In the larger context of the Vietnam War, Hamburger Hill is remembered as a pivotal moment. In the years since the battle, Hamburger Hill has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, but what really happened at Hamburger Hill? To answer the question, we have to go back to April 1969. On April, elements of the 1st Battalion, 5th, the soldiers of the 1/5th had orders to take the hill quickly and with minimal casualties. But the enemy was prepared and the battle was fierce. Despite the heavy fire, the soldiers pressed on. The soldiers responded instantly, their training kicking in as they returned fire and took cover. The battle raged on, lasting several hours, and the casualties began to mount. Then, just as the battle seemed like it would turn decisively against the Americans, reinforcements arrived. But the battle was far from over. Daybreak revealed the true extent of the fighting. The hill was littered with casualties and destroyed equipment. Throughout the day, the soldiers faced wave after wave of attacks, each more intense than the last. They held their ground, returning fire and neutralizing the enemy threat. But then something remarkable happened, but the victory was costly. Many of their comrades lay wounded or dead on the battlefield. In the end, and so it was that on that fateful day in April 1969, the soldiers of the 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment, May 29, 1989, The Wall Street Journal, Saigon, Vietnam. The Americans have gone. Life slowly returns to normal for Vietnamese after a decade of war. But still, there is a lingering question. What was it all about? What was this long and bloody conflict that has touched so many lives around the world? Their dreams, their hopes, their fears, their families, the places they're from, and what it must have been like to live through that time period. Consider the choices they made and the price they paid. It's not just the physical dangers that they face, but also the emotional toll of being away from home and loved ones for extended periods of time. Many soldiers have shared stories of the deep longing they feel for family and the sacrifices they must make to serve their country. For some, the desire to protect their loved ones is what drives them to become a soldier. It was a conflict that divided the nation and sparked intense debate about the role of the United States in the world. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., is a powerful symbol of the nation's gratitude and remembrance. This moving tribute draws visitors from around the world who come to pay their respects and learn about the human cost of the war. The wall is inscribed with the names of more than 58,000 Americans who lost their lives in Vietnam. After the withdrawal of U.S. troops, South Vietnam faced continued instability and eventually fell to the North Vietnamese in 1975. Its impact resonated far beyond the borders of Vietnam, shaping the geopolitical landscape and influencing global conflicts for decades to come. The war's legacy continues to be debated and analyzed by historians and policymakers alike, serving as a reminder of the complexities of international relations and the human cost of war. But it was also a tragedy for the Americans who lost their lives or were forever changed by their experiences in combat. The war raised difficult questions about the use of military force and the role of the United States in the world. It forced us to confront our own biases and prejudices and to examine our place in the global community. We learned that war is never easy and that even the best intentions can lead to unintended consequences. The Vietnam War left a deep scar on the country and its people, but it also played a significant role in shaping the geopolitical landscape of Southeast Asia. Let us strive to create a better world, a world that is more peaceful, more just, and more compassionate. But it's also a history that reminds us of the importance of peace, understanding, and compassion. As we remember the fallen today, let us also recommit ourselves to building a better future for all of us. A future based on the principles of peace, justice, and equality. A future that honors the sacrifice of those who came before us. Let us also take a moment to thank the veterans of the Vietnam War who returned home from that conflict. You came back to a nation divided, but you didn't let that stop you from serving your country. You went on to build families, raise children, and contribute to your communities in countless ways. Your service and sacrifice will never be forgotten. The war led to the rise of new political and military alliances in the region, including the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which was formed in 1961 to promote cooperation and stability in the region. Additionally, the war led to the establishment of the Interparliamentary Union, IPU, in 1962, which aimed to strengthen ties between nations and promote peaceful conflict resolution. May their sacrifice continue to inspire us to strive for a better world. Thank you for watching. Furthermore, the war contributed to the creation of the International Court of Justice, ICJ, in 1945, which serves as the principal judicial organ of the United Nations and settles legal disputes between states. Lastly, the war had a major impact on the development of international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions and the Red Cross movement, which sought to protect the lives of civilians and prisoners of war. It serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by these brave men and women and the profound impact their loss had on the nation. In addition to the memorial, the United States has also established programs to support veterans and their families. The war was a defining moment in recent history, and its effects continue to be felt today. The courage and sacrifice of those who fought in the war should never be forgotten. Neither should the lessons we learned from this conflict. The Vietnam War was a time of great turmoil and division. It was a time when our nation was deeply divided over the war and the draft. But it was also a time when our service members displayed incredible bravery and selflessness. They put their lives on the line to defend not only their fellow Americans, but also the people of South Vietnam. These initiatives provide crucial resources and assistance to those who need it most, ensuring that the sacrifices made by our service members are never forgotten. In the aftermath of the war, Americans grappled with the physical and emotional scars of combat, as well as the social and political divisions that had been exposed by the conflict. Some saw the conflict as a tragic mistake, while others viewed it as a necessary part of the Cold War. The war had a profound impact on American society, sparking heated debates about the nation's role in the world and the use of military force. However, over time, the United States has come to a more balanced perspective. The Vietnam War. It is now widely recognized as a complex and challenging conflict that tested the nation as strength and resolve. The war's legacy continues to be felt today, but the United States has learned valuable lessons about diplomacy, foreign policy, and the importance of public support for military interventions. Despite the challenges, Americans demonstrated remarkable resilience and determination to heal and move forward. The conflict had a profound impact on the global balance of power, leading to the end of the Cold War and the emergence of new economic and political alliances. The war also had a significant impact on the development of new technologies and military strategies. Looking back, we can see that the Vietnam War was a pivotal moment in history that shaped the world we live in today. It is a reminder of the complexities of international conflict and the importance of pursuing peace and understanding. They came together to support veterans, promote reconciliation, and honor the fallen. Through it all, the United States emerged as a nation transformed by the experiences of the Vietnam War. Others are motivated by a sense of duty or a need for adventure and excitement. Whatever the reason, the life of a soldier is one that requires great courage, discipline, and selflessness. Imagine the emotions of those who said goodbye at home not knowing if they would ever see their loved ones again. The veterans who returned home from war and the families who supported them through the challenges and uncertainties of their loved ones' service. During the Vietnam War, Many civilians risked their lives to help those in need. Medical staff worked tirelessly to save the wounded, while ordinary citizens provided food, shelter, and medical supplies to those who had nowhere else to turn. These acts of kindness and compassion were a testament to the resilience and humanity of the Vietnamese people. Even in the darkest days of the war, there were glimmers of hope and generosity that helped to sustain the Vietnamese people through one of the most challenging periods in their history. These are the unsung heroes of the Vietnam War who deserve our respect and gratitude. Think about the moments before going into battle, the uncertainty of the outcome, the knowledge that life may never be the same again. Who are the fallen? Why should we remember them? And how did they shape our world today? It's been over 50 years since the end of the Vietnam War, yet the impact of this conflict continues to resonate around the world. As we reflect on this dark chapter of history, let us remember the fallen, the brave men and women who fought and died in one of the most controversial wars in American history. Let us also reflect on the legacy of the Vietnam War and its lasting impact on the United States and the world. As you watch this video, think about the faces of the young men. By the end of the war, more than 58,000 Americans had lost their lives in Vietnam, with thousands more wounded or missing in action. They came from all walks of life, different races, religions, and backgrounds. Among them were 243 African Americans, 113 Native Americans, 383 Hispanic Americans, and over 4,700 Asian Americans. Of course, these numbers only represent a small portion of the total number of U.S. military personnel involved in the war, but it gives us an idea of the diversity of those who served and sacrificed during this conflict. These brave men and women put their lives on the line to protect the freedom and democracy, not just for themselves, but for the people of South Vietnam as well. Their courage and sacrifice should never be forgotten. A soldier's life is full of hardship and sacrifice. When we remember the fallen, let us also take a moment to appreciate the sacrifices of those still with us throughout history. There have been many instances where ordinary people have shown extraordinary courage in the face of adversity. The Vietnam War was a defining moment in American history. In the years since the Vietnam War, the United States has taken steps to honor the fallen and support their families. For many years after the war, the United States grappled with the legacy of Vietnam. Today, we live in a world that is vastly different from the one that existed before the Vietnam War, but the story doesn't end there. The Vietnam War was a defining moment in the 20th century, leaving an indelible mark on the world stage. As we remember the fallen, let us also take a moment to reflect on the legacy of the Vietnam War and its lasting impact on our world. In the end, the Vietnam War was a tragedy for all involved. It was a tragedy for the Vietnamese people who suffered the most. As we look back on the Vietnam War, let us remember the fallen, honor their sacrifice, and commit ourselves to making sure that their deaths were not in vain. The Vietnam War is a part of our nation's history that we must never forget. It's a history filled with courage, sacrifice, and loss. On this solemn day, we remember the fallen, the brave men and women who gave their all in the Vietnam War.